It's the dead of night. A government mail train is thundering through the English countryside, loaded with millions in untraceable cash. No alarms, no armed guards, just a handful of postal workers who have no idea what's about to happen to them. Now imagine that 15 men, a gang of thieves, a former pilot, a retired train driver, even a florist, have spent months planning to stop that train cold. Not in a movie, not in a comic book, in real life, in Britain in 1963. And here's the kicker. They nearly got away with it. What you're about to hear is the full story of the Great Train Robbery, one of the boldest crimes ever committed on British soil. A heist so brazen, so meticulously planned, and so spectacularly unraveled that it became the stuff of legend. This is the story of the men behind it, what drove them to do it, and the relentless hunt that followed. Every great crime story has a ringleader, and this one begins with a man named Bruce Reynolds. Reynolds grew up hard in 1930s London. His mother died when he was barely old enough to remember her. His father struggled for work and moved the family constantly through the roughest neighborhoods the city had to offer. When Bruce was evacuated to the countryside during World War II, like thousands of other London children, he bounced between host families, never really belonging anywhere. By the time he was a teenager, Bruce Reynolds had one defining quality. He was bored by anything ordinary. He tried the Navy, failed the eye test. He worked as a messenger for a newspaper, climbed his way into accounting, and walked out within months. The man simply couldn't sit still. What he found instead was crime, and he found that he was exceptionally good at it. Starting with small-time shoplifting alongside a cycle racing crew, Reynolds discovered a natural talent for theft. He was caught, of course, several times. He did stretches in juvenile detention, then adult prison. But prison, for Reynolds, wasn't a deterrent. He later described it as moving up, from prep school to university. Each sentence expanded his network and sharpened his ambition. Through the 1950s, Reynolds crafted an alter ego. By day, he posed as a rare antiques dealer, tailored suits, fine dining, Nietzsche on the nightstand, and Aston Martin in the driveway. By night, he robbed the same kinds of upscale homes and jewelry shops he pretended to be a client of. His crew eventually nicknamed him Napoleon, and it had nothing to do with height. It was about how he commanded a room, how he planned every angle, how he refused to leave anything to chance. By 1963, Reynolds was already notorious in London criminal circles. He'd led a successful heist at Heathrow Airport, netting his crew the equivalent of nearly £2 million in today's money. But that job wasn't the pinnacle. It was just the rehearsal. Reynolds wanted something bigger, something that people would remember. And in the summer of 1963, the opportunity arrived. A contact within the Royal Mail, a man Reynolds' crew knew only as the Ulsterman, passed along a piece of intelligence that was almost too good to be true. Every few days, the Royal Mail ran a train from Glasgow down to London carrying cash transfers between Scottish banks and the Bank of England. Not huge amounts, usually a few £100,000, nothing that would set the world on fire. But the 8th of August 1963 was different. The preceding Monday had been a Scottish bank holiday. That meant 3 days' worth of cash shipments had been sitting in Glasgow, waiting to move. According to the Ulsterman, that single train could be carrying somewhere in the neighborhood of £2 million, all of it sitting in one unguarded carriage, a HVP coach, positioned right behind the engine. Now, here was the thing about those HVP coaches. The post office knew they needed better security, alarms, radio equipment, reinforced windows. They'd even issued recommendations, but rolling out the upgrades was slow and expensive, and as of August 1963, only 3 of the coaches in the entire fleet had actually been fitted with the new gear. None of those 3 were scheduled to run that night. The window was open. Reynolds assembled a crew of 15 men, drawing from his own Southwest gang and a second outfit called the South Coast Raiders, plus a handful of specialists recruited for specific roles. Among them, a former pilot, a silversmith who moonlighted as a getaway driver with Formula One ambitions, a barber, a carpenter, yes, and a florist. They acquired a remote farm in Buckinghamshire called Leatherslade, a place they could use as a staging ground and lie low after the job. Through a lawyer Reynolds had on retainer, the purchase was arranged without raising suspicion. The plan itself was elegant in its construction. One group would intercept the train at a signal gantry about 1 kilometer from a bridge called Bridego. By covering the green light and hot wiring a red one, they'd fool the driver into stopping the train. From there, a replacement driver, a retired train engineer Biggs had recruited, would move the engine and the HVP coach down the track to the bridge. The rest of the crew would be waiting there to unload the cash using a human chain and vanish. Reynolds called this his Sistine Chapel. It was the most ambitious thing he'd ever planned. At just after 3 a.m. on August 8th, the Glasgow mail train rolled toward Sears Crossing, right on schedule. The men at the signal gantry made their move. The green light went dark. The red light flickered on. The driver braked. When he tried to call the nearest station, the line was dead. The telephone wires had already been cut. Before he could process what was happening, a robber was on board. The driver was restrained. His assistant was immobilized. A brief but brutal struggle broke out when the driver resisted, leaving him injured with serious head wounds. A reminder that however carefully Reynolds had planned a non-violent operation, things had already gone sideways. The HVP was forced open. The 4 postal staff inside fought back. They were overpowered. Within minutes, 128 mailbags of cash were identified and ready to move. Then came the first major hitch. The retired train driver recruited to move the engine, a man in his 60s who had worked with older steam locomotives, took one look at the modern vacuum brake controls in the cabin and froze. He had no idea how to operate them. The only man who could move the train was still lying on the floor with a bleeding head wound. Under duress, the injured driver was forced to guide the train down to Bridego Bridge himself. Once it arrived, the human chain went to work. In the darkness, 15 men passed heavy mailbag after mailbag from the carriage into the waiting army truck. The whole unloading operation took less than half an hour. By 3:30 a.m., Reynolds called it. They left 8 bags behind to stay on schedule. They took 120. When the team finally opened and counted those bags back at Leatherslade Farm, the total was staggering. Just under £2.5 million. In today's terms, well over £70 million. Every man in the crew would take home roughly £150,000. The plan had worked. Almost. The morning after the robbery, the story was already on every newspaper front page in the country. The police response was immediate and intense. Roadblocks, witness interviews, and a £260,000 reward for information about the gang's whereabouts. The robbers had planned to stay at Leatherslade Farm for a couple of weeks before moving out quietly, but as the police net tightened around Buckinghamshire, they panicked. They left the farm earlier than planned, and in their rush, they left something behind that would prove fatal. Fingerprints, a Monopoly board, a plate, a ketchup bottle, dozens of tiny traces scattered across the property. A local woman spotted the farm looking suspicious and called the police. When detectives arrived, they found a treasure trove of evidence. Meanwhile, the Flying Squad, Scotland Yard's elite crime unit, assigned a man named Tommy Butler to lead the investigation. Butler was the kind of detective who lived for the job. Single, decorated more than 30 times for outstanding service, he worked 7 days a week and brought to the case an almost obsessive determination to see it through. The arrests came quickly. One robber was caught trying to rent an apartment with nothing but £10 notes. Another's fingerprints turned up in the truck. The gang's own lawyer's signature appeared on the farm's bill of sale. By early 1964, 10 of the 16 conspirators had been arrested and convicted. Most of them handed sentences of up to 30 years. But the mastermind, Bruce Reynolds, was still out there. Reynolds knew they were coming for him. He fled north, changed his appearance, planted a decoy car near an airport to make police think he'd already left the country, and kept moving. When things got too hot in Britain, he obtained a fake passport, bribed a pilot, and slipped out through Belgium to Mexico. For a few years, the life he'd always wanted finally seemed within reach. Expensive hotels, fine restaurants, fast cars. But Reynolds had always been better at making money than keeping it. By the late 1960s, his fortune was almost gone. He tried to recruit old associates for one last job. Nobody was interested. Broke and out of options, Reynolds returned to London in 1968, and Tommy Butler was waiting. Butler knocked on the door. Reynolds' 6-year-old son answered. Within minutes after saying goodbye to his family, Reynolds was in handcuffs. His only comment? C'est la vie. That's life. He was sentenced to 25 years. He served 10. Reynolds wasn't the only one with a dramatic ending. Charlie Wilson, the crew member so tight-lipped detectives called him the Silent Man, was broken out of a maximum security prison just months after sentencing. 3 masked men scaled the walls in the dead of night, bypassed the guards, and walked Wilson straight out. He eventually surfaced in Canada, living quietly on a ranch outside Montreal under a false name with an altered face. He lasted there until Butler tracked him down again. And then there was Ronnie Biggs. Biggs had barely any role in the robbery itself. He was brought in specifically to find a train driver, and his driver turned out to be useless on the night. But Biggs became the most globally famous of all the robbers, not because of what he did, but because of what he refused to do: stay caught. He escaped prison using a grappling hook and a truck his wife had secretly arranged. He fled to Paris, then Australia, and eventually Brazil, a country with no extradition treaty with Britain at the time. For years, he lived openly, gave media interviews, sold autographs, and even recorded a song with the Sex Pistols. British intelligence tried everything to bring him back, including an unauthorized kidnapping operation that ended in an international diplomatic incident when Biggs was stuffed into a duffel bag labeled Live Anaconda and smuggled onto a boat. Brazil demanded him back anyway. Biggs finally returned to Britain voluntarily in 2001, aging, ill, and nearly broke. He was taken directly to prison. He was released in 2009. Both Biggs and Reynolds died in 2013. Of the nearly £2.5 million stolen on the night of August 8, 1963, police recovered less than £350,000. The rest, well over £2 million, was never found. The Great Train Robbery didn't just make headlines. It rewrote the public imagination of what a heist could look like. The men who pulled it off became unlikely folk heroes to some, career criminals to others. What's undeniable is that 60 years later, the story still grips us because at its core, it's about something very human, the belief that the perfect plan, executed with enough nerve, can change everything. Reynolds believed that. For one night on a Buckinghamshire railway line, he was almost right.